July 10th, 1940, the Air Ministry headquarters in London. Outside, the sounds of air raid sirens had become grimly routine. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the crushing weight of strategic desperation. Britain was alone, facing the full might of the Luftwaffe across the narrow channel, and the priority was survival. Every decision revolved around the immediate need for fighters, Spitfires and Hurricanes to contest the skies above the island. Yet, even as production lines strained, the essential raw materials required for modern warfare were drying up. Aluminum, high-tensile steel, duralumin, these strategic metals were finite and desperately allocated. They were the lifeblood of the war machine, reserved exclusively for aircraft components, tank plating, and ship construction. Everything else was secondary. This scarcity created an intellectual chasm between what the Royal Air Force knew it needed: robust, heavily armed, multi-purpose bombers, and what the industrial base could actually provide. Into this crisis walked the de Havilland Aircraft Company, not with a proposal for another metal behemoth, but with an idea that senior RAF officials found quaint, almost insulting. They proposed a high-speed, unarmed bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, built not primarily of aluminum, but of wood. Balsa, birch, plywood, spruce materials traditionally associated with furniture and gliders, not frontline combat aviation. The Air Ministry, rooted in the doctrine that a bomber must be heavily armored and capable of defending itself against fighter attack, scoffed. The standard specification demanded a crew of at least 3 defensive turrets and powerful armor plating. De Havilland's concept, which they initially dubbed the DH-98, defied every element of established operational requirement. It had 2 engines, a crew of 2, no defensive guns whatsoever, and was constructed largely by cabinet makers and piano builders. It was a liability on paper, a fragile target waiting to be shredded by German cannon fire. The initial reaction was a cold dismissal. Why would the RAF devote factory space and manpower to producing what seemed like an oversized, flammable training plane when every resource had to be directed toward the Hurricane or the Wellington? They were looking for armored might. De Havilland offered them lightness and speed. But the designers at Hatfield were thinking outside the box dictated by the scarcity of metals. They realized that by utilizing non-strategic materials, wood being relatively abundant and processable by decentralized, non-traditional wartime factories, they could avoid the bottleneck that crippled aluminum production. Furthermore, they made a radical calculation. Armament and armor were heavy. Weight meant slower speeds, and slower speeds necessitated armor for defense. If they eliminated the defensive weight, they could make the aircraft light enough and powerful enough to simply fly away from any attacker. The proposed top speed was astronomical for a bomber, over 400 miles per hour, driven by 2 powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. The senior operational staff were skeptical, believing the wooden airframe would disintegrate under the stresses of such velocity, or that a wooden structure simply could not absorb the heavy punishment of enemy flak like a metal frame could. For months, the project languished, labeled unnecessary, unconventional, and inherently vulnerable. It was deemed a distraction from the real war effort. The aircraft which they had hoped would fill the reconnaissance gap left by the losses suffered in France was instead relegated to a back-burner project, surviving only due to the sheer persistence and quiet conviction of the de Havilland team, who began building prototypes privately, using the slimmest of mandates, waiting for the day when performance alone would finally convince the doubters that the wooden wonder was not a relic of a bygone era, but the future of swift, high-altitude warfare. September 3, 1939, at the Air Ministry in London, the doctrine governing Britain's aerial might was rigid, heavy, and deeply rooted in the lessons or misinterpretations of the previous decade. The prevailing wisdom dictated that the modern bomber must embody resilience above all else. It was an article of faith that the path to victory relied upon the ability of the bomber stream to absorb punishment, fight its way through the enemy defenses, and deliver its ordnance. Survivability, therefore, was intrinsically linked to mass. The aircraft's skin must be aluminum alloy, tough enough to withstand flak and cannon shells. Its fuselage must bristle with lethal reciprocal firepower. This meant multiple hydraulic or electrically operated turrets, mounting twin Vickers or Browning machine guns, designed to carve intersecting defensive zones in the high-altitude void. Protection of the crew and vital systems was non-negotiable, demanding hundreds of pounds of steel armor plating wrapped around the pilots, the fuel tanks, and the oil coolers. In this paradigm, speed was desirable, certainly, but it was necessarily secondary, sacrificed on the altar of payload capacity and defensive armament. The enemy fighters, it was assumed, would always find the bomber stream. Therefore, the only way through the gauntlet of the Luftwaffe was to fight through it, relying on heavy metal, structured fortitude, and the accumulated weight of machine guns to ensure a fighting chance for the crew. The concept proposed by the de Havilland team a machine built entirely without guns, without armor, and primarily of plywood and balsa wood was not merely a design variation. It was a wholesale, ideological rejection of the fundamental tenets of strategic bombing established by the highest levels of the RAF hierarchy. To the senior officers and procurement committees who had invested heavily in the metal beasts that were the Wellington, the Sterling, and soon the Lancaster, the idea of a wooden bomber seemed hopelessly anachronistic. It was associated with the fragile, easily ignited biplanes of the Great War, aircraft utterly unsuited for the high speeds and high altitudes of contemporary aerial combat. They saw the Mosquito as unprotected, flimsy, and suicidal. They questioned how a bomber could possibly survive over Berlin if it lacked the capacity to def itself against a determined attack from a Messerschmitt Bf 109. They failed entirely to grasp the revolutionary calculation that formed the heart of the Mosquito's existence, that if a bomber is fast enough, the interception never successfully materializes. If it is fast enough, the inherent weakness of wood is irrelevant because the structure is never hit. If it is fast enough, defensive firepower becomes nothing more than dead weight that drags down performance. This deep philosophical rift, the divide between the heavy metal orthodoxy and the high-speed heresy, ensured that while mighty four-engine designs that perfectly embodied the prevailing doctrine received priority in the full industrial weight of Britain, the wooden wonder remained marooned in the bureaucratic doldrums. It was dismissed as a minor reconnaissance project, a sideline diversion designated by the Air Ministry as an experimental oddity, awaiting the undeniable confirmation that speed, and speed alone, could redefine survivability in the lethal calculus of modern aerial warfare. The performance figures that the de Havilland team quietly achieved in those initial prototypes were so far outside the established norm that the military leadership simply refused to believe them, demanding evidence that transcended theory and manifested an indisputable victory over the fastest German interceptors. The very material that made the Mosquito unique its wood construction was simultaneously the chief source of its unparalleled speed and the primary fuel for the institutional skepticism that nearly prevented its existence. The man behind this radical aircraft was Sir Geoffrey de Havilland. His philosophy was deceptively simple. In modern aerial combat, speed was the ultimate armor. If a plane could outrun its enemy, it did not need heavy plating or defensive machine guns, which only added crippling weight and reduced performance. For a heavy bomber, armor was essential. For a light, fast platform, it was a liability. He believed that the single most effective countermeasure against enemy fighters was simply to arrive, perform the mission, and depart before they could even scramble a successful interception. The choice of wood balsa, sandwiched between layers of birch plywood, was initially a necessity imposed by circumstance. When de Havilland proposed the project in 1938, the Ministry of Aircraft Production warned him that every ounce of strategic metal, particularly aluminum, was earmarked for frontline fighters like the Spitfire and Hurricane. De Havilland saw this limitation not as a roadblock, but as a revolutionary opportunity. Wood was lighter, easier for non-specialist furniture manufacturers to work with, and crucially, allowed for incredibly smooth, perfectly aerodynamic surfaces that conventional metal airframes often struggled to achieve due to the need for structural fasteners and overlapping panels. The fuselage was built in two halves like a large polished canoe hull, glued together and wrapped in specialized doped fabric. This method eliminated rivets and joints, ensuring the air passed over the Mosquito with minimal drag. This wooden construction allowed the two powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engines that powered the Spitfire, to drive an exceptionally lightweight airframe to unheard-of velocities. The original Ministry Specification P-13/36, the document governing new bomber design, called for heavy defensive armament, but de Havilland tossed the manual aside. His proposed bomber, the DH-98, would carry no defensive guns whatsoever. It would rely entirely on raw speed, a concept that horrified traditionalists in the Air Ministry, many of whom saw the lack of guns as bordering on criminal negligence toward the crew. They demanded fighter escort requirements be maintained, overlooking the fundamental reality that no existing British fighter could keep up with the Mosquito itself. It took months of political struggle, lobbying, and the desperate intervention of key figures who shared de Havilland's unorthodox vision. But he was finally granted permission to build a single prototype on a private venture basis, classifying it initially as a photo-reconnaissance aircraft to bypass the strict bomber requirements. When the prototype, W-4050, finally took to the air on November 25, 1940, in the midst of the escalating blitz, its performance was immediately stunning. Equipped with two Merlin 21 engines, it instantly surpassed the top speed of every single frontline fighter in the Royal Air Force inventory, including the newly introduced Spitfire V. The Mosquito flew at 38.2 miles per hour. This speed was not just marginally better, it was a full 30 miles per hour faster than the fastest operational German interceptor, the Messerschmitt Bf-199F. This test flight was the moment that theory hardened into incontrovertible fact. The initial skepticism vanished, replaced by an urgent, almost panicked clamor for production. The operational reality had crushed the institutional prejudices. The wooden wonder was born not from overwhelming military enthusiasm, but from a persistent, almost stubborn brilliance that proved traditional air combat doctrines utterly, definitively wrong. It was clear now that Britain had an aircraft that could penetrate enemy airspace at will, perform its duties, and return home with impunity simply because nothing the Luftwaffe possessed could catch it. The Mosquito had traded the security of armor for the simple guarantee of evasion, and it was a trade that worked better than de Havilland himself had perhaps even promised. January 10, 1941, inside the Ministry of Aircraft Production offices in London. The astonishing performance metrics of the new de Havilland prototype did more than just prove the efficacy of high speed over heavy armor. They completely vindicated the radical structural choice that had nearly doomed the project from the start. For the High Command, the Mosquito's speed was its great asset, but for the strategists managing the collapsing supply chain, its material composition was the true miracle. As the war tightened its grip, Britain was facing a crippling shortage of strategic materials. Aluminum, high-grade steel, and alloys were indispensable components for the Spitfires, the Hurricanes, and the growing fleet of four-engine heavy bombers. Every ounce of duralumin produced was immediately earmarked for the most critical programs, often leaving secondary and experimental designs starved for raw materials. The initial insistence by Geoffrey de Havilland that his design should be made almost entirely of wood was not merely an aesthetic or an engineering preference. It was a profound strategic workaround. He was designing an aircraft that consumed none of the resources already placed on ration. The Mosquito was, fundamentally, a solution to a national supply crisis. This wooden wonder was constructed primarily from laminated birch plywood, spruce and balsa wood, materials which, while essential in peacetime industries like furniture making and piano manufacturing, were considered utterly non-strategic for wartime aviation. This reliance on non-critical materials meant that production of the Mosquito did not compete with or detract from the established supply lines feeding the Supermarine or Avro production halls. The process involved shaping thin sheets of plywood, sandwiching them around a core of lightweight balsa often imported from Ecuador, and gluing them together using specialized urea formaldehyde adhesives. This technique created an incredibly stiff yet extraordinarily light monocoque fuselage shell, entirely bypassing the need for heavy internal metal frameworks. The simplicity of the materials allowed de Havilland to revolutionize where and how the aircraft was built. Unlike aluminum fabrication, which required massive specialized tooling facilities, the wooden structure could be manufactured in countless small, decentralized workshops. Factories that had previously crafted cabinets, coffins, or pianos were swiftly converted into airframe component manufacturers. This dispersal of production offered two immediate strategic benefits. First, it rapidly increased the manufacturing volume, far beyond what a single, centralized aircraft plant could manage under wartime pressure. And second, it provided intrinsic protection against concentrated Luftwaffe bombing raids. If one small cabinet maker in High Wycombe was struck, the entire airframe production did not grind to a halt. Sections built in scattered shops were simply transported to final assembly points, glued together, and fitted with the necessary engines and equipment. The initial dismissal of the concept as archaic, a reversion to the flimsy biplanes of the Great War, proved definitively wrong. Wood, properly laminated and engineered, possessed an incredible strength-to-weight ratio. Furthermore, the wooden structure proved far more forgiving when subjected to enemy fire than its metal counterparts. A bullet passing through an aluminum wing might cause severe tearing, stress fractures, and compromise structural integrity, forcing the aircraft out of service. A bullet passing through a laminated plywood wing, however, often resulted in a clean hole that did not propagate or tear, meaning damage could often be repaired using simple woodworking techniques in the field. This increased survivability and ease of maintenance further cemented the Mosquito's reputation not just as a high-performance machine, but as the most resource-efficient aircraft of its generation, turning discarded materials into a strategic weapon that delivered intelligence-performed precision bombing and eventually hunted the fastest fighters of the Axis powers. Despite these undeniable operational successes, the proven performance, the survivability, and the ingenious use of resource-light construction, the revolutionary nature of the Mosquito meant that within the conservative, centralized halls of Whitehall, it faced constant, often venomous, resistance. The Air Ministry was steeped in the doctrine of all-metal construction, believing that modern aerial warfare demanded heavy monocoque structures, integral armor, and, above all, defensive armament. De Havilland's concept flew in the face of every procurement dogma established since the First World War. To many senior officials, the reliance on plywood, balsa, and spruce was not seen as a brilliant strategic workaround for wartime shortages, but as a dangerous regression. They dismissed the aircraft as a flimsy, volatile contraption, a relic of obsolescent design principles that had no place competing alongside the magnificent metal engineering of the Spitfire, the Hurricane, or the Lancaster. Furthermore, the decision to strip the Mosquito of all defensive guns a radical move, predicated entirely on speed, was considered professional negligence, bordering on suicidal design. Procurement committees repeatedly raised fears over the plane's structural integrity, predicting catastrophic failures under the sustained stress of high-speed maneuvers or modest flak damage. The fragility of the wooden wonder became a persistent, pejorative moniker used by those who were fundamentally incapable of accepting that speed could be a superior form of defense to armor plating. They simply could not fathom an aircraft designed not to fight its way through, but rather to exploit its own velocity to ensure it was never engaged in the first place. This philosophical impasse defined the Mosquito's earliest struggles. Even after initial successful prototypes took flight and shattered performance records, the supply ministry repeatedly attempted to delay production orders, arguing that the manufacturing process involving furniture factories, piano makers, and cabinet shops was too unorthodox, too scattered, and demanded scarce woodworkers who they insisted should be drafted into essential war service instead of building these apparent toys. The few champions of the design, such as Sir Wilfrid Freeman and the forward-thinking minds within coastal and bomber commands, had to wage a continuous bureaucratic war to keep the production lines open. They fought against powerful internal factions who sought to divert the few allocated resources towards bolstering established, proven metal aircraft programs, viewing the Mosquito as an unnecessary distraction or, worse, a temporary novelty. Officials argued that the Mosquito's payload was too small for heavy raids and its range too limited for deep strategic penetration, completely overlooking the precision and speed that allowed it to accomplish missions no heavy bomber could dare attempt in daylight. The Whitehall critics maintained that the aircraft was inherently fragile and incapable of sustained service in the brutal European theater. They worried about moisture penetration degrading the wooden structure and the impact of temperature extremes on the glues and joints, concerns that were largely unfounded given the innovative bonding agents de Havilland utilized. The deep-seated skepticism persisted, forcing the designers and the operational crews to prove the concept anew with every successful mission, until the statistical evidence of its low casualty rate and unmatched delivery efficiency became simply impossible for the bureaucracy to ignore. Yet even when the Mosquito was racking up mission successes, achieving unprecedented levels of photographic reconnaissance and low-level precision bombing, the underlying bureaucratic resentment against its unconventional origins lingered, a constant threat to its continued expansion and utilization. They remained fixated on the material, dismissing the genius of the aerodynamic form, unable to concede that in the quest for military supremacy, sometimes the simplest, oldest material could yield the most technologically advanced weapon. Geoffrey de Havilland and his chief designer, R.E. Bishop, understood that appealing directly to the ingrained prejudice of the procurement boards was a losing battle. If the Mosquito was ever to reach full production and prove its revolutionary concept, it could not wait for the official blessing of high priority status, which was quite rightly in the eyes of the establishment reserved for the massive, metal-heavy bombers that constituted the industrial backbone of Bomber Command. Instead of fighting the system, they chose to sidestep it entirely, treating the Air Ministry's apathy not as a hurdle, but as a protective shroud. Lacking a high priority rating meant they were largely ignored by the central planning committees, which paradoxically granted them the freedom to develop the aircraft in relative secrecy, out of sight of the critics and the constant threat of cancellation. This lack of official blessing forced de Havilland to adopt a radically decentralized and unorthodox manufacturing process. They couldn't compete with the likes of Avro or Vickers for skilled metal workers, high-grade aluminum, or the massive industrial presses needed for all-metal construction. They turned instead to the quiet, dispersed industries of Great Britain that had never before touched aviation. Piano manufacturers, cabinet makers, yacht builders, and specialized furniture factories. These were the new production lines for the Mosquito. Small workshops that traditionally produced wardrobes and sideboards were suddenly crafting laminated fuselage shells out of specialized plywood and balsa wood. This dispersal across hundreds of small, isolated facilities served multiple strategic purposes. Firstly, it tapped into a vast reserve of skilled woodworkers who were not needed for the high-priority metal programs. Secondly, it drastically reduced the vulnerability of the production process to Luftwaffe bombing, scattering the critical components across the British countryside instead of concentrating them in one massive, recognizable factory complex. The wood, treated with new synthetic resins and layered with balsa, was not merely a convenient substitute, it was engineered. This construction method proved not only quick to master by non-specialist labor, but also astonishingly strong, lightweight, and aerodynamically clean, enabling the laminar flow wing design that allowed the aircraft to cheat the air. De Havilland was selling a superior technology packaged within a familiar, non-threatening material envelope. Production ramped up quietly, module by module, built in sheds and garages, proving that technological advancement did not require the complete destruction of traditional craft. By the time the Air Ministry began to recognize the operational necessity of a high-speed, unarmed reconnaissance and bomber, platform a need emphasized by the ever-increasing effectiveness of German air defenses, the Mosquito was already reaching maturity. The aircraft effectively presented the bureaucrats with a fait accompli. Here was an aircraft that was already flying faster than anything else in the Commonwealth fleet, performing missions previously deemed suicidal, and doing so without consuming the resources they so jealously guarded. Performance was the only language the bureaucracy could not dismiss. When the prototype, having achieved speeds approaching 400 miles per hour faster than the contemporary Spitfire and Hurricane, finally entered squadron service in late 1941, its immediate success began to unravel years of prejudice. It was not just fast, it had operational versatility that defied category. It excelled as a strategic reconnaissance aircraft, flying so high and fast over the Reich that interception was almost impossible, providing critical intelligence that informed all major Allied raids. It became a highly successful light bomber, carrying a payload equivalent to the much larger B-17 Flying Fortress over medium ranges, often relying simply on its speed to reach the target and escape before fighters could scramble to altitude. It evolved into a devastating night fighter, carrying the new microwave radar sets, and performed the crucial pathfinder role, marking targets for the heavy bomber fleets. The Air Ministry, having attempted to pigeonhole the Mosquito as a stopgap or a specialized tool, now found they had a universal, true multi-role combat aircraft years ahead of its time. The fact that the Mosquito was consistently required to perform the most dangerous, demanding, and high-visibility missions was the ultimate proof of de Havilland's genius and the vindication of their decision to bypass official channels. The wood that had been deemed obsolete became the material of the future, enabling an operational tempo that the heavy bomber fleets, plagued by attrition, could only envy. The very material that was supposed to deny the Mosquito priority now provided its lifeblood, drawing on non-essential labor and resources to fill the skies with a weapon that delivered surgical strikes at impossible velocity. They had built a weapon of modern warfare, using the techniques of a bygone industrial age, achieving tactical supremacy not through bulk, but through sheer speed and evasion. November 25, 1940. Hatfield Aerodrome. A small crowd, mostly de Havilland engineers and a few skeptical officials, gathered to watch the culmination of the unofficial project. Prototype W4-3, 5 painted and raw, stood ready. It was a stripped-down machine, designed purely to prove the concept of speed through lightness. When test pilot Jeffrey de Havilland Jr. throttled the twin Merlins, the aircraft surged forward, demonstrating a power-to-weight ratio that instantly set it apart from every other twin-engine aircraft then flying. The takeoff roll was shockingly short. Within minutes, the data began pouring in. The Air Ministry had grudgingly accepted a target speed of 380 miles per hour. That figure had been considered ambitious, nearly impossible for an aircraft of its size. But W4050 was not merely fast. It was blazing. Initial readings confirmed a top speed well over 390 miles per hour, even with non-optimized components. Further high-altitude testing pushed that figure toward the previously untouchable 400 miles per hour threshold. The comparison was damning to the established military hierarchy. The fastest operational fighter in the RAF at that time was the Spitfire Mark V, capable of approximately 370 miles per hour under normal combat loads. Here was a medium bomber, built primarily of plywood, that was demonstrably faster than the interceptors designed to shoot it down. It was a statistical anomaly that rewrote the rules of aerial warfare overnight. The previously lukewarm support vanished, replaced by a desperate scramble for production. The Air Ministry, which had spent months delaying the design as an irrelevance, now demanded immediate operational deployment. The aircraft was given its formal designation, the Mosquito, fitting for its sting and its difficult-to-catch nature. The design shifted instantly from the status of a risky experiment to a national priority. The tactical implications were instantly grasped by those tasked with long-range reconnaissance. Until this point, daylight intelligence gathering deep over German territory was prohibitively costly, requiring heavily escorted formations or fast, but lightly armed modified bombers that often fell victim to the Luftwaffe's superior operational height ceiling. The Mosquito eliminated the need for escort entirely. Its speed was its defensive screen. Its altitude capability was its invisibility cloak. The initial variants focused entirely on this mission, the photo reconnaissance, or PR. MKI. These early Mosquitoes, carrying no guns and only specialized cameras, were capable of flying to Berlin, circling major targets at 30,000 feet or more, and returning safely before German ground control could even effectively vector interceptors onto their tail. The psychological impact of these missions was almost as important as the intelligence gathered. The Germans rapidly learned that an isolated Mosquito meant a mission completed and data collected. Ermengarring, The Reichsmarschall and head of the Luftwaffe famously expressed his bitterness. "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford to use metal, fly with wood, a piece of wood that every one of our firms would scorn. They have the fastest bomber in the world, and we don't have it. What do we have? We have the best pilots, but they don't have the machines." This wooden phantom, designed in direct opposition to bureaucratic dogma, began operational life not as a bomber, but as an untouchable spy. It confirmed that the de Havilland gamble had paid off. Strategic advantage was not always about thick armor plate or heavy defensive firepower sometimes. It was simply about getting there faster than anyone else and being gone before the enemy could react. And the Mosquito was proving capable of flying circles around the best that the Axis air forces could throw at it, turning the skies of occupied Europe into its own private cruising altitude. July 20th, 1941, at RAF Station Boscombe Down, the mood in the control tower was skeptical, even slightly hostile. Air Ministry officials, who had reluctantly sanctioned the project but never truly believed in the concept of the unarmed bomber, watched as the prototype Mosquito, sleek and utterly devoid of heavy metal armor or gun turrets, taxied onto the runway. The test was simple: demonstrate that the wooden wonder could not merely survive, but utterly negate the threat of the RAF's most powerful, fastest interceptor aircraft. For comparison, a flight of Spitfire Mk VBs, the current zenith of British fighter technology, stood ready on the tarmac. Their pilots were the elite, accustomed to dominating the European skies. They viewed the Mosquito's mission with open contempt. A fighter pilot's job was to kill bombers, and no bomber should ever be faster than the machine designed to hunt it. The unspoken challenge was clear: if the bomber could escape, it fundamentally changed everything they knew about air superiority. The Mosquito took off, the roar of its twin Rolls-Royce Merlins echoing the power derived from liquid-cooled performance engines. It quickly climbed, leveling off at 25,000 feet, where the thin air was expected to slightly temper its speed, but where the fighter's pursuit would be hampered. The Spitfires launched shortly after, the chase beginning in earnest. The plan was for the Spitfires to approach from different vectors, simulating a coordinated attack. But as the Mosquito's pilot pushed the throttle levers against the stops, the sheer velocity of the wooden machine began to defy expectation. The Spitfires, magnificent aircraft though they were carrying wing guns and armor plate, adding crucial weight that the minimalist Mosquito simply did not possess. In a straight line round at altitude, the Mosquito was flying into territory normally reserved for the highest performance fighters, not medium bombers. Within minutes, the pilots in the Spitfires were straining, pushing their powerful Merlin engines into the redline limits of continuous operational speed. They were accustomed to closing on the heavy, slower German Heinkels and Dorniers. They were accustomed to holding the speed advantage. But against the de Havilland design, they were losing ground. The Mosquito was not just fast, it was untouchable. The reports filtering back to the control tower were astonishing. The Spitfire pilots, forced to acknowledge the impossible, reported that they could not close the distance. They struggled just to maintain visual contact with the dark, streaking shape ahead of them. When the Spitfires reached their maximum sustainable speed, the Mosquito simply pulled further ahead, demonstrating a clear speed differential of 30 to 40 miles per hour at operating altitude. The test was conclusive. The aircraft that the Air Ministry had tried repeatedly to cancel, the aircraft built out of necessity from non-strategic materials like wood and glue, was the fastest operational machine in the entire Royal Air Force inventory. It flew circles around the interceptors designed specifically to destroy it. This inherent speed advantage fundamentally redefined the role of the Mosquito. It meant no need for heavy defensive armament, no need for the crews to endure the weight penalties of armor plating, and critically, it allowed the Mosquito to fly its missions almost completely independent of fighter escort. If the enemy could not catch you, they could not shoot you down. This concept, proven over the fields of Wiltshire, would soon be exported to the European theater, transforming reconnaissance and tactical bombing. The Germans soon learned that intercepting the high-flying, phantom-fast Mosquito was less a tactical objective and more a matter of sheer, impossible luck. September 20th, 1941, over Brest Harbor, occupied France, the first operational Mosquito PR. I soared at an altitude few German fighters could comfortably sustain. This initial reconnaissance mission was not a high-speed chase, but rather an insultingly casual observation flight, executed miles above the effective ceiling of the Messerschmitts scrambling below. Luftwaffe pilots were bewildered by the contact reports, a fast twin-engined aircraft, too high to be clearly identified, leaving contrails in the thin air and impossible to pin down. The very notion of an unarmed bomber flying deep into Reich-controlled airspace, taking photographs and simply exiting the theater without resistance, was fundamentally incompatible with German air doctrine. They expected heavy bombers, slow and guarded, not a streamlined apparition made primarily of lightweight wood. The operational ceiling of the early versions exceeded 29,000 feet, and cruising speeds routinely pushed past 370 miles per hour. German fighter control often reported contacts that simply vanished, dissolving into the cloud layers or accelerating away from the attempted intercepts before the defending aircraft could achieve attack vector. This phenomenon quickly earned the Mosquito various nicknames among the frustrated Luftwaffe staff, including the derisive but respectful Wooden Wonder, but also the more ominous Muck or Mosquito. It was a pest that could bite anywhere, anytime, and disappear instantly. When the photographic reconnaissance missions transitioned into low-yield tactical bombing sorties, the speed advantage became even more pronounced and devastating. The Mosquito B, IV variant, stripped of defensive armament but carrying up to 2,000 pounds of bombs, specialized in pinprick accuracy strikes and morale-shattering daylight raids. The most famous early example was the assault against the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, Norway in September 1942, designed to coincide with a large Quisling regime parade. The Germans had little warning, and their response time was fatally slow. By the time their interceptors were airborne, the raid was over, and the bombers were streaking out over the North Sea, already beyond pursuit range. This immunity conferred by velocity began to change the fabric of strategic bombing planning. The RAF realized that speed allowed for extraordinary precision strikes on targets previously considered too hazardous for conventional daylight operations, minimizing collateral damage and maximizing psychological impact. They could now reliably plan raids around specific events, disrupting German schedules, celebrations, or propaganda efforts with an almost personal audacity. The ultimate demonstration of this operational defiance occurred during the now legendary daylight raids on Berlin. While the city was protected by one of the densest anti-aircraft defenses in the world, the Mosquitoes began making surprise, high-speed dashes into the heart of the capital. Perhaps the most humiliating instance for the Reich occurred on January 30th, 1943. Hermann Göring was scheduled to give a major propaganda speech celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Nazi Party's rise to power, broadcast live to the nation. Minutes before he was due to speak, mosquitoes hit the main radio station broadcasting the event and the nearby government printing office. The attacks were quick, brutal, and perfectly timed. The resulting interruption was minor in terms of physical damage, but the symbolic blow was catastrophic. The message broadcast across Europe was clear. The British could strike the very center of German power in broad daylight, while Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe, was preparing to boast about the impregnability of the Reich. Göring was reportedly apoplectic, demanding how such raids could occur without interception. The reality was that even the latest versions of the standard German fighters, the formidable Focke-Wulf 190, still required a significant advantage in altitude and position just to attempt the chase. The Mosquito pilots, seasoned professionals by 1943, knew the exact escape routes and altitude bands where their speed was maximized. Their defense was simply pulling away, leaving the frustrated Luftwaffe pilots wallowing in their own contrails miles behind. The strategic consequences extend far beyond morale. The Germans were forced to divert significant resources, including precious high-altitude oxygen equipment and specialized interceptor squadrons like the newly formed Jagdgeschwader 25 and 50, dedicated solely to hunting the Muck. These units, employing modified high-performance fighters like the Bf-199G series with stripped weight and optimized engines, represented a desperate admission of defeat concerning conventional interception. Every highly trained pilot and specialized aircraft tasked with hunting an unarmed wooden plane was one less resource available for defending against the growing threat of American heavy bomber raids or fighting on the Eastern Front. The Mosquito, by its sheer speed, was effectively tying down elements of the Luftwaffe that should have been fighting elsewhere. January 30th, 1943, 11 a.m., over Berlin. The strategic potential unlocked by the Mosquito's speed was not merely defensive, it was aggressively offensive. Conventional Allied wisdom dictated that daylight bombing of highly deft targets required massive formations of heavily armored aircraft flying at extreme altitude, supported by vast fighter screens. The cost in men and machines for deep penetration raids using these standard methods was often astronomical, and the accuracy, even with the newest Norden bomb sights, was limited to general areas rather than specific structures. The Mosquito changed the calculus entirely, because it could guarantee penetration and egress against the best interceptors the Axis possessed. The door opened for true precision strikes missions that were unthinkable for a Lancaster or a Flying Fortress, regardless of escort. These raids targeted high-value, small installations, railway junctions, specialized factories, communication centers, and, crucially, buildings of immense political or psychological significance. The most famous demonstration of this capability occurred on that cold morning in 1943, while Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, was preparing to give a speech marking the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power. Two lone Mosquitoes of No. 105 Squadron arrived over the capital. They bombed the main Berlin radio station, knocking the broadcast off the air and forcing Göring's address to be delayed and relocated. Just hours later, a second strike hit the headquarters of the Ministry of Propaganda, disrupting a major event planned by Joseph Goebbels. These attacks carried little physical weight compared to the thousands of tons dropped nightly by Bomber Command, but their psychological impact was profound. They proved that the RAF could hit the nerve centers of the Reich with pinpoint accuracy, in broad daylight, and with impunity. The fact that the raids were conducted at low altitude, allowing the crews to visibly identify the specific buildings before the attack run, only enhanced the insult. The German public and, more importantly, the Nazi leadership suddenly understood that no location was safe, not even the most protected government offices in the capital during the daytime. This realization forced the diversion of even more crucial resources, high-altitude anti-aircraft batteries and specialized air defense units, away from the industrial Ruhr and the coastal defenses to protect political centers. The speed of the Mosquito demanded a completely different approach to flak defenses. Because the wooden bomber was often moving at 350 miles per hour or more at treetop level, standard proximity-fused shells were useless. Flak crews had mere seconds to acquire, track, and fire, often relying on small-caliber cannon and machine guns rather than heavy artillery. The precision bombing carried out by the fast-flying Mossies was therefore characterized by low-level, high-risk dashes. The planes would scream in under the radar coverage, execute shallow dive attacks, often releasing 4,000-pound cookies or specialized armor-piercing ordnance, and be gone before the defenses could fully coordinate a response. This ability to execute high-speed, deep-penetration, low-level strikes became vital in the lead-up to D-Day, when the Allies needed to cripple specific components of the German transportation network without causing mass collateral damage. Bridge abutments, specific locomotive sheds, V-weapon launch sites, and Gestapo headquarters in occupied territory were all targeted by these fast, two-man crews who needed unparalleled navigational accuracy and nerve. They flew the equivalent of surgical strikes, demonstrating that the future of aerial warfare lay not just in mass bombing, but in the rapid, accurate application of force against highly specific points. January 29, 1944, 4 a.m. Over Berlin, the operational challenge for the Luftwaffe was stark. They were tasked with intercepting an enemy that operated almost entirely outside the established rules of engagement. When radar operators picked up the blip small, fast, and fleeting, they quickly scrambled their front-line defense. The Messerschmitt Bf-199, the long-serving workhorse, and the formidable Focke-Wulf 19, the butcher bird. Both were excellent fighters, rugged, heavily armed, and successful against Allied heavy bombers. But against the Mosquito, they faced a wholly different kind of threat. The typical interception doctrine relied on the fighter's ability to climb rapidly and engage a target that, while often heavily defed, was fundamentally slower. A fully loaded Mosquito B IB could sustain speeds nearing 400 miles per hour at cruising altitude, and its operational ceiling was higher than the optimum combat altitude for many standard German interceptors. To catch the Mosquito, the German pilots had to push their aircraft to the extreme limits of their operational capability, often running into the thick, frigid air where engine performance dropped off sharply. The standard Bf-109G series, already burdened by necessary defensive armor, often struggled to close the gap. Even the excellent 4199A series found itself chasing shadows. Luftwaffe pilots quickly realized they could only successfully engage a Mosquito if the British plane was already slowing for a run on the target, or if the German fighter achieved a massive advantage through a plunging attack from an altitude already held far above the Mosquito's flight path. This required perfect vectoring from ground control, a coordination that was consistently hampered by the Mosquito's erratic, high-speed approach paths. Compounding the speed problem was the aircraft's construction. The Germans dubbed it the Wooden Wonder with a mix of disdain and grudging respect. Constructed primarily of plywood, balsa wood, and laminated veneer, the Mosquito possessed a radar cross-section significantly smaller than its all-metal contemporaries. The advanced Würzburg and Freya radar systems, designed to track the massive metal hulls of Lancasters and Fortresses, struggled to maintain a consistent lock on the light composite structure of the British intruder. The reflection was often weak, making precise ground guidance almost impossible, especially amidst the electronic chaos of Allied jamming. For German night fighter crews, many flying radar-equipped Junkers U-88s, the task was even more disheartening. Their bulky radar antennae created significant drag, reducing their top speed just when they needed it most. They were flying, floating metal targets, while the Mosquito was essentially a ghost, moving too fast and too low on the radar screen to be effectively tracked by airborne intercept radar of the era. The only reliable countermeasure the Luftwaffe eventually developed was Desperation, assigning specialized high-altitude variants, particularly the stripped-down, lightweight Me-199K4 and certain F-199D-199K4 and certain F-1190D models, the famed Dora, to specific standing patrols. These pilots were ordered to loiter at extreme altitude, conserving fuel and waiting for the mere chance that a Mosquito would pass below them, allowing them a single high-speed dive before the ghost plane vanished back into the night or the clouds. But these missions were taxing, expensive, and rarely successful. The presence of the Mosquito in German airspace became less a military threat to be intercepted and more a deep, grinding psychological irritant. It proved that the RAF could reach any target in the Reich by day or by night with impunity, often executing attacks so swiftly that air raid sirens were still sounding the warning long after the wooden bomber was halfway back across the North Sea. It symbolized the failure of the Reich's air defense shield, not because German pilots lacked courage, but because British designers had achieved an almost unreachable superiority in operational speed and stealth. This frustration culminated in one of the most famous and damaging raids of the war, an attack designed to humiliate the very leadership that promised invulnerability. January 30th, 1943, over the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the Mosquitoes of Bomber Command were assigned a mission of pure psychological warfare. It was the 10th anniversary of Hitler's seizure of power, and high-ranking officials were gathered for celebratory speeches, culminating in a live broadcast featuring Hermann Göring himself. As Göring began his address, promising the German people that no enemy bomber could ever reach the heart of the Reich, 3 Mosquitoes, flying almost on the deck, swept over the center of the city. Their low-level pass was audacious, timed perfectly to interrupt the live radio feed. The resulting crackle of machine gun fire and the roar of the Merlins, broadcast across the entire German airwaves, was devastatingly effective. This was no mass raid, this was surgical humiliation. They had not only penetrated the Leggery air defenses, but had done so with an aircraft considered an historical anomaly, a throwback to the biplane era. This performance solidified the reputation of the Mosquito, confirming that its speed was its ultimate defense. Yet the story of its enduring legacy is not just one of performance, but one of logistics and material science. When the Air Ministry had scoffed at the wooden prototype, they were looking through the wrong of the strategic telescope. They saw frailness and obsolescence. De Havilland saw strength through material neutrality. Because the airframe was built primarily of balsa wood and birch plywood, wrapped and bonded by specialized resins, the Mosquito required none of the strategic light alloys like duralumin that were desperately needed for Spitfires, Lancasters, and Beaufighters. This material allowed the aircraft to bypass the central bottleneck of British wartime production, the highly specialized, often heavily bombed, all-metal aircraft factories. Instead, de Havilland decentralized production across the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, farming out components to workshops previously dedicated to peacetime industries. Piano builders constructed the sleek, aerodynamic noses. Furniture makers, with generations of expertise in bonding and laminating wood, crafted the fuselage halves in small, clean facilities. Even toy manufacturers assisted with smaller components. This distributed low-technology manufacturing system meant that the Mosquito was not only fast in the air, but fast off the production line. By 1944, production peaked, with hundreds of aircraft rolling out of places that had never before seen an airplane component, creating a robust supply chain immune to the targeted bombing that plagued Germany's centralized, all-metal factories. Furthermore, the wooden construction provided remarkable structural resilience. Plywood sheeting does not shear or fragment like aluminum when hit by shrapnel or cannon fire. It teased to splinter or absorb the impact, often localizing the damage. Pilots routinely brought Mosquitoes home missing large sections of wing or fuselage, damage that would have critically weakened an equivalent stressed skin metal aircraft. The Mosquito became the universal tool of the Allied air forces. If a mission required high-altitude, long-range photo reconnaissance, the unarmed PR, I-nth flew it, outpacing the Focke-Wulf 190's attempting interception. If a Pathfinder needed to accurately mark a target area deep inside Germany, the specialized Bomber Command Mosquito did it, relying only on speed to survive. And when the war transitioned to low-level anti-shipping strikes or intruder night fighter missions, the cannon and machine gun armed variants proved deadly against ground targets and enemy night bombers alike. In the aircraft that the British Air Ministry almost scrapped, the wooden bomber, considered a step backward, achieved an operational lifespan and versatility unmatched by almost any other major combat aircraft of the war. After VE Day, the Mosquito transitioned seamlessly into civil service, flying mail and high-speed passenger routes until the rise of the jet age. It stands as the ultimate testament to engineering ingenuity over material orthodoxy, a Leggery multi-role aircraft born from the discarded materials of the past.